My own daughter smiled right at me as she tricked me into signing away my entire life savings. For weeks, she had me trapped in my own home pretending to be a loving daughter while she planned to steal everything I owned. She thought I was just a weak old woman she could control, but she had no idea who she was messing with, and the cold, calculated justice I delivered was something she never saw coming. You know, turning 69 is a funny thing. You'd think I'd be alarmed by it, but honestly, I found it more amusing than anything else. What wasn't amusing was the look on my daughter's face. Clara was there in my living room with a smile stretched so tight across her face I thought it might crack. It was a brilliant, wide smile, the kind you see in magazines, but it never once reached her eyes. That's what alarmed me. She moved around the room which she grew up in with the forced energy of a CEO at a company retreat, all bright and professional. Her husband, Robert, a man who seemed to have misplaced his spine somewhere in his mid-30s, just trailed in her wake, trying his best to look equally enthusiastic. She asked if I wanted more tea. Her voice just a little too loud, a little too cheerful for the quiet afternoon. But I noticed her eyes weren't on the antique teapot or on me. They kept flicking over to the mahogany desk in the corner right where I keep all my important papers. Just for a second, I saw something else in her expression, something hungry and anxious, before she plastered that perfect, empty smile back on. It was then I realized this wasn't a visit. It was an operation. The whole thing, this campaign of excessive care, had started a couple of weeks back. After 5 years of a cold, bitter silence between us, suddenly my phone was ringing off the hook. It was always Clara, her voice dripping with a concern I hadn't heard in years. She told me she was worried about me all alone in this big house. Then came the unannounced visits. They started bringing my groceries, insisting I shouldn't be lifting heavy things. They began screening my calls, and Robert even took to answering my mail, telling me it was just to take the burden off my shoulders. I remember him patting my hand as he said it, while his other hand casually moved the cordless phone just out of my reach. Even my neighbors, good people I've known for 30 years, were being turned away at the door. Clara would meet them with a sad, practiced sigh and explain that I was resting and really shouldn't be disturbed. I wasn't being cared for. I was being managed. I was being put into a gilded cage, and my own daughter was holding the key. The real betrayal, though, came after the small, suffocating birthday dinner they'd arranged. Clara pulled a thick stack of papers out of her expensive leather briefcase, placing them on the table with a flourish. She explained it was just some routine estate planning, something about moving assets into a more modern trust to protect me from taxes. She said their lawyer, a Mr. Henderson, had drawn it all up. She pointed to a line at the bottom of a page filled with dense, unreadable legal jargon and told me to sign right there. A cold, sharp needle of suspicion pricked at my heart. I'd been a bank manager for 40 years. I know what it feels like when something isn't right. But I was tired. Tired from the performance of the day. Tired from the years of silence, and a stubborn, foolish part of me, the mother in me, wanted to believe this was real. I wanted my daughter back. So against every instinct screaming in my head, I picked up the pen and signed my name. What I signed wasn't a trust document. It was a durable power of attorney, and I had just handed my daughter absolute control over everything my husband and I had spent our lives building. I couldn't sleep that night. The house was too quiet, my thoughts too loud. I got up for a glass of water and was padding down the hallway when I heard voices from the guest room. It was Clara on the phone, but it wasn't the voice I knew. The professional polish was gone, stripped away, leaving something raw and panicked. I heard her hiss into the receiver that they didn't understand that she'd told them she'd have the first transfer by Friday. There was a pause. Then she said it was done. The house, the portfolios, everything. She told them I had signed it. After another long, heavy silence, I heard her voice again, now pleading. She begged them to just give her until the end of the week, promising they would get all of their money. Then the line went dead. I stood there frozen in the dark hallway, the needle of suspicion, now a shard of ice, twisting in my gut. This wasn't about estate planning. That deadline wasn't for a tax filing. This was something else entirely. Something desperate and dangerous, and I had just signed my name right in the middle of it. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I just lay there in the dark, the pieces clicking into place. The horror I'd felt in the hallway didn't curdle into fear. Instead, it chilled, hardened, and settled into a cold, diamond-hard clarity. The kind of clarity I used to get at the bank when I was looking at a high-risk loan application and could see the rot beneath the polished numbers. My daughter was playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were my entire life. So the next morning, I became a bank manager again. I was calm, deliberate, and I was going to assess the risks. I chose my moment perfectly. I waited until Clara left for one of her very important meetings in the city, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor with a sense of urgent purpose. She left Robert behind as my designated watchdog, which was her first mistake. Robert was always the weak link. He's a man so concerned with appearances that he can't handle the messy details of an actual conspiracy. I found him in the sunroom pretending to read the financial news on his tablet. I made 2 cups of coffee and brought them in, placing one on the table beside him. I made sure my hand trembled just a little. I started by telling him how grateful I was, how good he and Clara were for handling all this business for me. Then I went in for the probe. I asked him about the lawyer, Mr. Henderson. I said I'd love to have his number just to call and thank him for his hard work. The effect was instantaneous. All the color drained from Robert's face. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped bird looking for an open window. He stammered that Henderson was a very busy man, that Clara handled all the communication because it was more efficient. He couldn't even look at me. I just smiled a gentle, confused old woman's smile. I told him I understood, but that I liked to do things the old-fashioned way and would just look him up myself. Henderson, I asked, spelled just like it sounds. Sheer panic flashed across his face. He knew as well as I did that there was no Mr. Henderson to look up. He started sputtering that he'd made a mistake, that the name was actually Henderson Clark. A double-barreled name he added, as if that made the lie more believable. He was actually sweating now, his clumsy deception crumbling under the weight of a single gentle question. The pristine air of the sunroom suddenly smelled of his fear. A moment later, his phone buzzed. It was Clara. His side of the conversation was a series of frantic, panicked whispers. It was all the confirmation I needed. They were scrambling, trying to patch a lie that was already falling apart. Their panic gave me the opening I needed. While they were busy with their damage control, I slipped into my late husband's study, a room they'd deemed unimportant. Tucked in the back of his desk drawer was an old pay-as-you-go burner phone he kept for emergencies. My hands trembled as I picked it up, but it wasn't from fear. It was a surge of pure adrenaline. I dialed a number I knew by heart. When he answered, I kept my voice low and urgent. I told him my name was Eleanor Vance and I needed his help. I was in trouble. The man on the other end was Arthur Jennings. He'd been my husband's best friend and our lawyer for 40 years. He was retired now, but he was sharper than ever and loyal to a fault. I finally had an ally. That evening, the entire atmosphere of the house changed. When Clara returned, her bright false smile was gone. In its place was a tight, watchful glare. The pretense of care had vanished completely, leaving a cold, oppressive tension that hung in the air. Doors were now kept closed. The phone was kept in Clara's purse. I realized they weren't just isolating me anymore, they were guarding me. I was no longer an asset to be managed. I was a threat to be contained. Lying in bed that night, listening to their strained, angry whispers from the guest room, I finally understood the full picture. This wasn't just about the money anymore. My daughter wasn't just trying to rob me. She was a cornered animal, and I was the one standing in her only escape route. The game had changed. I was no longer a player. I was the prey. When you're hunting a dangerous animal, you don't charge at it head on. You set a trap, and you make the animal believe it's safe. The next morning, I initiated my strategic retreat. As Clara brought me my morning tea, her face a mask of cold watchfulness, I let out a little gasp and pressed a hand to my chest. I complained of a sudden dizzy spell, allowing my body to sag with a theatrical weakness that would have earned me an award. She and Robert rushed to my side, their concern suddenly looking real again, if only for a moment. I let them fuss over me, let them help me back to my bed, and I looked up at my daughter with a face full of frail compliance. I told her that perhaps she was right, that all this business was far too much for me, and that I should just rest. The look of triumphant relief that passed between Clara and Robert was so obvious it was almost comical. The old woman was giving up. Their little panic was over. They were back in control. Of course, I was anything but resting. From the quiet of my bedroom, I feigned a deep, exhausted sleep. But behind my closed eyes, my mind was a whirlwind of activity, mapping out every step of my counteroffensive. As soon as I heard them settle downstairs, I pulled out the burner phone. In a series of quiet, coded text messages, I gave Arthur his instructions. He was to go to a small, independent bank in the next town over and access a safe deposit box. This box wasn't in my name, but in the name of a shell corporation I'd set up 30 years ago, a little contingency plan from my banking days that even my late husband hadn't known about. Inside, I told him he would find a complete set of original documents, spare keys to everything, and a credit card tied to an account that Clara had no way of discovering. While my enemies believed I was defeated and dormant, I was quietly reassembling my arsenal piece by piece. Their belief in my submission made them arrogant, and arrogance made them sloppy. Clara, now convinced she had neutralized me as a threat, started treating my house like her own corporate office. She took over my husband's study and would leave her laptop open, logged into everything, for hours at a time. From my bedroom door, which I kept strategically ajar, I had a perfect view. And what I saw told the whole story. I saw an email with a subject line in bold red letters, "Final Notice of Eviction." I saw a long, threatening chain of messages from a group of parents from my grandchildren's school referencing a failed investment group and demanding their money back. I realized the person on the phone that night wasn't some shadowy loan shark. It was people just like her people she had defrauded after being defrauded herself in some kind of Ponzi scheme. The pressure on her was immense. I could see it. It wasn't just about money. It was about the impending social death in the unforgiving elite world she'd tried so desperately to conquer. One afternoon I watched as she made a frantic, tearful call to my grandchildren's private school, literally begging for a tuition extension. A few minutes later, she was speaking openly with Robert about which of my stock portfolios they should liquidate first to cover the most pressing debts. Every word she spoke, every careless click of her mouse was another piece of evidence for me. She was so confident in my defeat that she didn't see the web I was spinning. She was too busy handing me the very rope I would use to ensnare her. The clock was ticking. It was Thursday morning, one day before Clara's desperate Friday deadline. I had spent the last day in my room, a ghost in my own home, listening. I heard her frantic calls to my brokerage firm, her voice tight with frustration as she was met with security protocols and delays. She was trying to liquidate my portfolio, and Arthur, armed with the information from the safe deposit box, was already running interference from the outside. The trap was set. All that was left was to spring it. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell chimed a sharp, clean sound that sliced through the tense quiet of the house. I watched from the top of the stairs as Clara, looking annoyed at the interruption, swung the front door open. Standing on the porch was Arthur Jennings, looking exactly as he had for 40 years, crisp suit, polished shoes, and a leather briefcase that held more power than a judge's gavel. I saw Clara's face shift from irritation to confusion, and then to a dawning, sickening horror. Before she could even think to slam the door, I made my move. I descended the staircase not as a frail, dizzy old woman, but as Eleanor Vance, the woman who had managed the finances of half the county. I was fully dressed, my posture was perfect, and my voice when I spoke was clear and strong. I thanked Arthur for coming on such short notice, and the look on my daughter's face was one of pure, unadulterated panic. The confrontation took place in the formal living room. The air was so thick with tension you could barely breathe. Clara and Robert sat huddled on the sofa like defendants at their own trial. I took the armchair opposite them, the seat of power in the room. Arthur didn't waste any time. He opened his briefcase and laid 2 documents on the coffee table between us. The first was a copy of the original unaltered Vance Family Trust, a document he and my husband had drafted decades ago. The second was a detailed report from my brokerage firm showing a series of unauthorized liquidation requests initiated by Clara 2 days prior. Arthur let the silence hang for a moment before he spoke, his voice calm and lethal. He informed Clara that the power of attorney she had me sign was a fraudulent document, and that her transaction requests constituted felony financial elder abuse. That was it. That was the final blow. The carefully constructed facade of my daughter, the high-powered professional, the caring mother, didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. A sound came out of her, a raw, guttural sob of pure animal despair. The words came tumbling after a torrent of confession. She told us everything. The Ponzi scheme that had wiped her out, the crippling debt, the eviction notice on her pristine Manhattan condo, the shame, the terror of her perfect world collapsing around her. She confessed the whole desperate, sordid story, not as an excuse, but as a final pathetic plea for an understanding she had no right to ask for. Beside her, Robert was pale and silent, his complicity laid bare. Then, in a stunning act of cowardice, he turned on her, hissing that this was all her idea. Their pathetic conspiracy didn't just fracture, it disintegrated in a storm of blame and fear. In that moment, the power in the room shifted for good. I was no longer the victim. I was in complete control. I looked at the wreckage of my only child, a woman so consumed by the fear of failure that she had become a monster, and I felt a profound, aching sorrow. But sorrow is a luxury. Justice is a necessity. I told her the police were on their way and that they would have questions about the fraud and the attempted theft. Then I turned to Arthur and instructed him to file the necessary injunctions to freeze every account and to have that fraudulent power of attorney nullified effective immediately. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was dictating the terms of surrender, leaving my daughter and her husband powerless, stripped of their lies, and terrified of the public reckoning that was inevitably coming for them. The police came just as I said they would. There was no screaming, no struggle. Just a quiet, humiliating procedure that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. After they were processed and released pending arraignment, Arthur arranged the final meeting. It wasn't going to be another emotional confrontation in my living room. This required something different. This was business. The final reckoning took place a week later in the sterile, quiet conference room of Arthur Jennings's law office. We had told them it was a final settlement discussion, a chance to negotiate the terms of their surrender. They arrived looking like ghosts. Clara and Robert were hollowed out their expensive clothes, hanging on them like costumes for a life they had already lost. They walked in expecting to plead their case, to throw themselves on my mercy. They were not prepared for who was already seated at the large mahogany table. There was Detective Miller, the officer handling the Elder fraud case, his face a mask of professional neutrality. And next to him sat a distinguished silver-haired man in a perfectly tailored suit. It was the real Mr. Henderson, a senior partner at the firm, and a man whose good name my daughter had so carelessly and foolishly invoked in her lies. I was already seated at the head of the table. I was the picture of calm authority. I didn't need to raise my voice. The evidence was going to do all the screaming for me. With Arthur guiding the proceedings, we systematically dismantled their entire world. He laid the forged power of attorney on the table. He played the audio recording from my burner phone of Clara's panicked, overheard conversation. He produced bank statements showing the flagged liquidation attempts and a detailed timeline of my calculated isolation, which was corroborated by signed written statements from the very neighbors Clara had turned away. Each piece of evidence was another nail hammered into the coffin of their lies. But the real punishment, the true judgment, didn't come from me. It came from the quiet, palpable condemnation of the outsiders in that room. Detective Miller's professional impassivity was its own kind of judgment. But it was Mr. Henderson's reaction that sealed Clara's fate. The look of cold, professional disgust on his face, as he stated for the record that he had never met, spoken to, or prepared any documents for Clara Vance, was the moment her identity as a savvy, successful professional was publicly and permanently destroyed. The shame that radiated from her was so thick you could feel it. She had built her entire world on an image of success, and I had just shattered that image in front of the very type of person whose approval she so desperately craved. That was a sentence worse than any prison. Then it was my turn. I delivered the final consequences with the precision of a surgeon. I told her that the criminal charges would proceed and that she would have to face the legal consequences of her actions. I then slid a document across the polished table. It was a restraining order legally barring her and Robert from my property and from any form of contact forever. A second document followed it, a formal, irrevocable amendment to my will and trust, officially and completely disinheriting my only child. My voice dropped to an almost whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. I told her that she wanted my money so badly, but she would never see another penny of it. She was on her own now. It wasn't cruel. It was just. It was the proportionate and final consequence for a betrayal so profound it had severed the bonds of family forever. The justice was cold, clean, and absolute. After that day in the law office, there wasn't some big dramatic explosion. Clara and Robert's world didn't end with a bang. It was more of a quiet implosion, the silent, relentless turning of legal and social gears that ground their life to dust. The arrest itself was discreet, but in the gossipy ecosystem of Westchester and Manhattan's elite news, like that spreads faster than a virus. Almost overnight, they were socially excommunicated. Their names vanished from invitation lists, and their calls simply went unanswered. The financial ruin that had been their biggest fear was now their reality. The luxury condo was sold at a loss to pay off creditors. The children were pulled from their expensive private school. Finally, they filed for bankruptcy, a public declaration of the failure they had committed, a monstrous crime to hide. Under that immense pressure, their paths diverged. Robert, true to form, crumbled completely. He cooperated fully with the prosecution, trading his testimony against his wife for a lighter sentence. It was his final, pathetic act of self-preservation, and it cemented Clara's legal fate. After that, He just drifted into obscurity, a broken man who would forever be defined by his spectacular failure. Clara, however, didn't crumble. She hardened. During her time in prison, from what I heard through Arthur, she never showed a single ounce of remorse. All she had was a bitter, simmering resentment. She was a victim in her own twisted story, forever blaming me for not simply handing over the fortune she felt she was owed. For me, the new reality was one of authentic peace. You see, the victory wasn't in my daughter's imprisonment or my son-in-law's disgrace. The victory was in my own liberation. The big house, which had become my gilded cage, suddenly felt spacious and full of light again. I started having coffee with the very neighbors Clara had worked so hard to isolate me from, and our conversations were filled with genuine warmth and friendship. I took the considerable resources I now fully controlled and established a charitable foundation in my late husband's name. Its purpose is to fund legal aid for victims of financial elder abuse. The wealth that had been a target for my daughter's greed was now a tool for my own purpose. I didn't find a new life by erasing the past. I found it by transforming its pain into strength. The final scene of this story takes place about 6 months later. I'm in my garden, my hands in the rich soil, the late afternoon sun warming my face. I'm not alone. Arthur is on the patio laughing with a few of my old friends. There's an ease about me, a lightness in my chest that had been absent for years. The house behind me is filled with the sounds of life, not the oppressive silence of fear. I am strong, independent, and for the first time in a long time, truly content. The phone rings inside, a sharp sound in the peaceful air, but I pay it no mind. I don't feel that jolt of anxiety anymore. I know who it isn't. The new permanent dynamic of my life is not one of conflict, but of a quiet, unbreachable boundary. I had faced the wicked legacy of my daughter's desperation, and I had emerged not as a victim, but as the architect of my own peaceful future. In the end, Eleanor Vance's story teaches a difficult but powerful lesson. It shows us that understanding the desperate reasons behind a betrayal doesn't erase the harm it causes. Her daughter's actions came from a place of real fear and shame, but her choices were still her own. Eleanor's journey reminds us that true strength isn't found in cruel revenge, but in the calm, methodical pursuit of justice. It proves that while you can have compassion for another's pain, you never have to accept the destruction they create. True peace comes from setting unbreakable boundaries and reclaiming your own life.